So, here's where this story ends up. A handful of young people, mostly women in their late teens and early 20s, are sitting in prison cells, locked away for some of the most brutal murders America has ever seen. One of their victims? A woman who was 8 months pregnant and the so-called mastermind behind it all, Charles Manson. He's not around anymore. He died in 2017, rotting away in a California prison hospital. The shocking part isn't just that the murders happened. It's how they happened. How does a small-time criminal with a cheap guitar and a knack for manipulation go from drifting in and out of prison to orchestrating one of the most infamous massacres in modern history? To understand it, we have to rewind. Back to Los Angeles in the summer of 1969. Now, when you picture LA in the late 60s, what comes to mind? Peace signs, tie-dye shirts, hippie communes, psychedelic drugs, free love. The counterculture movement was in full swing, and Los Angeles, especially Hollywood, was selling this image of endless sunshine and youthful rebellion. Celebrities were throwing glamorous parties in the Hollywood Hills. Music was booming. The Doors, the Byrds, the Beach Boys, the Beatles blasting from every radio. On the surface, it was all freedom and flower power. People thought they were living through a cultural revolution, and for a while, it looked like they were. But in August 1969, that illusion shattered in the bloodiest way possible. Let's start on Cielo Drive, a quiet street tucked away in Benedict Canyon, home to the rich and famous. On a street sat a luxury home that had once belonged to Doris Day's son, record producer Terry Melcher. But by that summer, the house was being rented by actress Sharon Tate and her husband, director Roman Polanski. Sharon was only 26 years old, glowing and very pregnant, 8.5 months along. On the night of August 9th, she had friends over. Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist, Abigail Folger, the coffee heiress, and her boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski. A young man named Stephen Parent stopped by too, just to visit the property caretaker. And then, sometime after midnight, the nightmare began. The next morning, when police walked into that house, what they saw was chaos. Bodies everywhere, blood smeared across the walls. Sharon Tate, brutally checked out. Jay Sebring, tied up and shot. Abigail Folger, stabbed dozens of times as she tried to run for her life. Wojciech Frykowski, beaten, shot, and stabbed over and over. Even Stephen Parent, just a teenager, checked out in his car on his way out. The sheer violence was staggering. And to make it even more surreal, there were words scrawled in blood around the house. Pig, written on the front door in Sharon Tate's blood. Who would do this? And why? Nobody had answers. But then, just when the city was reeling from that horror, less than 24 hours later, it happened again. This time, it was in Los Feliz, at the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Leno was a wealthy supermarket owner. Rosemary ran a clothing business. They weren't Hollywood elites. They weren't counterculture icons. Just an ordinary married couple. That night, intruders broke in, tied them up, and checked them out in their own home. Leno was stabbed with a bayonet, left with a knife sticking out of his throat and a carving fork in his stomach. Rosemary was stabbed dozens of times. And again, messages were left in blood on the walls. Death to pigs. Rise. And the word Helter Skelter scrawled across the refrigerator. 2 nights. 7 people. Murdered. Random victims. No clear motive. And a city that thought it was safe suddenly plunged into fear. Now, here's the thing. No one knew these crimes were connected. The police were scrambling. The press was panicking. And the public was terrified. Hollywood stars started hiring private security, buying guard dogs, and some even fled Los Angeles altogether. For a city built on image and illusion, this was a full-on collapse of the dream. The summer of love, that was gone. What had just happened looked like something out of a nightmare, and nobody, absolutely nobody, knew who was responsible yet. So, to understand how Charles Manson became, well, Charles Manson, you've got to rewind all the way back to the beginning. And spoiler alert, there's nothing glamorous about it. No rock star mystique. No evil genius origins. Just neglect, rejection, and a whole lot of bad choices stacked on top of each other. Charles Mills Manson was born in November 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was only 16 years old, a teenage runaway who had no idea how to raise a child. His father, out of the picture before Charles even took his first breath. The kid didn't have stability from day one. When he was just a baby, his mom was arrested for armed robbery. Think about that. Not even old enough to walk, and already abandoned to relatives while his mother sat in prison. By the time Kathleen got out, she wasn't exactly winning any Parent of the Year awards. She was young, reckless, into partying, and not particularly interested in raising a kid. At one point, she reportedly even tried to trade Charles for a pitcher of beer. That's the level of care we're talking about here. So little Charles bounced around, living with relatives, spending time in foster care, and eventually getting shipped off to reform schools. What he never really got was what every kid needs: love, stability, and a sense of belonging. And that's a theme that's going to follow him for the rest of his life. Now, kids who grow up in chaos often look for control wherever they can get it. And for Manson, that meant crime. By the time he was a teenager, he was already breaking into places, stealing cars, running scams. He wasn't some brilliant mastermind. He was just surviving the only way he knew how. But those early crimes got him a one-way ticket into the juvenile justice system. And once you're in, it's a cycle that's hard to escape. Manson was in and out of institutions throughout his youth. One of the big ones was the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C. He was also sent to places like the Federal Reformatory in Virginia. These weren't cushy boarding schools. They were tough, often violent environments where kids learned how to fight, manipulate, and out-hustle each other just to get by. Charles wasn't exactly a star pupil either. He was known for being a troublemaker, constantly trying to escape. And when he wasn't running, he was learning the art of manipulation. By the time he was an adult, prison was basically home. He spent time in the Terminal Island Prison in California, the Federal Reformatory, and even the U.S. Penitentiary on McNeil Island in Washington. And here's where things start to get interesting. Because prison is where Manson sharpened the tools he would later use to devastating effect. First, he picked up the guitar. He wasn't the next Bob Dylan, but he could strum enough to carry a tune. And more importantly, he used music as a hook to draw people in. Around this time, he met Alvin "Creepy" Karpis, a former member of the notorious Ma Barker gang and one of the last old-school Depression-era gangsters. Karpis gave Manson some lessons on guitar, but he also noticed something else: Manson's uncanny ability to manipulate people. Karpis later said Manson was a master manipulator. Think about that. A career criminal who had seen it all, pointing out just how dangerous this skinny little inmate could be. And while he was in prison, Manson also became obsessed with music, especially the Beatles. He believed their songs had hidden messages, clues, prophecies, cosmic signals meant for him. To you and me, it sounds delusional, but to him, it was fuel for the twisted worldview he was building. Fast forward to 1967. Charles Manson is released from prison after spending more than half his life locked up. And when he steps out, he's carrying all of $35 in his pocket and a guitar slung over his shoulder. That's it. That's what the system gave him to start over. And guess what? He doesn't start over. Not really. Instead, he lands right in the middle of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, the epicenter of the hippie movement. Imagine the timing. Summer of love. Psychedelic drugs everywhere. Music festivals. Free sex. A generation disillusioned with their parents' values and searching for meaning. And suddenly, here comes Charles Manson. He's older than most of the Flower Children. He's been hardened by years in prison, and he knows how to read people. To these young, lost souls, he looks like a wise, spiritual leader. To him, they're easy prey. And here's the irony. You couldn't script it better. A man with a history of violence, manipulation, and crime walks out of prison and steps right into a movement built on peace and love. What could possibly go wrong? Spoiler: everything. So, Charles Manson walks out of prison and starts building himself a family. Not in the normal sense. No picket fence, no steady job, no PTA meetings. His version of a family is something much darker. It all starts with Mary Bruner, a young woman working as a librarian at UC Berkeley. She was bright, independent on the surface, but she also felt isolated, like she didn't quite fit in. And Manson, well, he knew how to spot that kind of vulnerability from a mile away. He talked to her like he understood her better than anyone else ever had. He promised her freedom, love, and purpose. Before long, she was letting him move into her apartment. And then, she quit her job to follow him. That's how it began. Manson's recruitment methods were simple but brutally effective. First, he targeted people, mostly young women, who came from tough backgrounds. Girls who had run away from home, who had abusive parents, or who just felt invisible in the world. He gave them attention, made them feel special. Then he added drugs into the mix. LSD, marijuana, whatever would break down their sense of self. And while their defenses were lowered, he'd spin this hypnotic blend of philosophy, music, and manipulation. To these lost kids, it felt like he was offering answers. In reality, he was stripping them of independence and reshaping them into loyal followers. And soon, there were more. Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, Lynette Squeaky Fromm, Leslie Van Houten. The list kept growing. They called themselves the Family, and to outsiders, they looked like just another hippie commune. But behind the scenes, they were becoming a tightly controlled cult orbiting around one man. Of course, they still had to survive, so the Family started dabbling in petty crimes: credit card fraud, shoplifting, stealing cars. Nothing glamorous, just enough to keep the group fed and the drugs flowing. And because this was the 60s, they did it all while living out of an old yellow school bus that they'd painted over with psychedelic designs. That bus became their trademark. You'd see them piled inside, driving up and down California, long hair flying, guitars in hand, singing songs like they were the next great folk band. To strangers on the road, they might have looked like harmless drifters chasing the hippie dream, but what they were building was something far more dangerous. Then comes the Hollywood connection. And this is where the story takes a wild turn. One day in 1968, two of Manson's followers are hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway when they're picked up by none other than Dennis Wilson, the drummer for the Beach Boys. Wilson was at the height of his fame, living that rock star life with a mansion in Pacific Palisades, constant parties, and women everywhere. He sees these two free-spirited girls on the side of the road, and he's intrigued. He takes them home. And here's where things escalate. Dennis leaves for a recording session, and when he comes back late that night, his driveway is packed with Manson and a whole gaggle of his followers. Instead of being horrified, Dennis is fascinated. These people call him brother. They treat him like a spiritual king, and he eats it up. Within days, the entire family has moved into his house. We're talking about dozens of people lounging around, eating his food, driving his cars, and basically living rent-free in the home of a beach boy. Now, for Manson, this is the golden ticket. He's always had that dream of making it big as a musician, and suddenly, he's got a direct line into the heart of the Los Angeles music scene. He plays guitar for Wilson. He writes songs. He even records some tracks in professional studios. Dennis introduces him to big names, and one of the biggest was Terry Melcher, a record producer who just so happened to be Doris Day's son. Melcher had the kind of influence that could make or break careers in Hollywood. And for a hot second, it looked like Manson might actually make it. But then, reality check. Terry Melcher listens to Manson's music, and while he's polite about it, he's not impressed. He passes on signing him. Around the same time, Dennis Wilson's manager takes one look at this wild commune trashing Wilson's mansion and says, "Absolutely not." The freeloaders are kicked out, and just like that, Manson's brush with Hollywood stardom is over. And here's the dangerous part. Manson wasn't just disappointed. He was furious. That rejection from Hollywood, especially from Terry Melcher, cut deep. It wasn't just losing out on fame. In his mind, it was betrayal. And betrayal, for Manson, was fuel. He took all that anger, all that resentment, and started channeling it into darker, more violent fantasies. This is the pivot point. The dream of being a rock star is gone. The peace and love mask is slipping. And the next version of Charles Manson that emerges, he's not chasing record deals anymore. He's chasing chaos. So after Hollywood slammed the door in his face, Charles Manson needed a new stage. And he found it at a place straight out of a forgotten Western, Spahn Ranch. Spahn Ranch was this dusty, broken-down former movie set in the Santa Susana Mountains, just outside Los Angeles. Back in the 40s and 50s, it had been alive with cowboys and saloons, your classic Hollywood backdrop for B-movie westerns. But by the late 60s, it was practically a ghost town. The only person left running the place was George Spahn, an elderly, half-blind ranch owner in his 80s. He let the family move in rent-free in exchange for chores. And, let's be real, the company of some of the young women who took turns keeping him happy. For Manson, it was perfect. Isolated, away from cops, away from nosy neighbors, away from the Hollywood industry that had just rejected him. Out there in the dry hills, surrounded by old movie props and horses, Manson could play the role he'd been auditioning for all his life. The all-knowing guru with a flock of devoted followers. And because they were so cut off from the outside world, he had complete control. What they ate, what they wore, who they slept with, Manson dictated all of it. And while they were holed up at the ranch, Manson's ideas were getting darker, way darker. Here comes Helter Skelter. Now, if you've ever heard the Beatles song, you know it's just a loud, chaotic rock track about a carnival slide. But to Manson, it wasn't about a slide at all. It was prophecy. He claimed the Beatles were sending him a secret message, warning of an impending race war in America. In his mind, Black people were going to rise up, overthrow white society, and kill off the establishment. And when the dust settled, he and his family would emerge from a secret underground bunker in the desert and take over as the new rulers of the world. Sounds insane, right? Because it was. But here's the terrifying part. His followers bought into it. They were young, drugged, isolated, and desperate to believe that the man they saw as a messiah was leading them toward some higher purpose. And Manson, he wasn't just predicting this so-called race war. He believed he could accelerate it. But delusions don't pay the bills. And around July of 1969, Manson decided the family needed money to get ready for Helter Skelter. That's where Gary Hinman comes in. Gary Hinman was a musician and a part-time teacher, someone who had been friendly with the family. Manson believed he had money, inheritance money to be exact. So he sent some of his followers, including Bobby Beausoleil, to convince Gary to hand it over, with convince being code for do whatever it takes. For 2 days, Hinman was held captive in his own home. They beat him. They tortured him. At one point, Manson himself showed up and slashed Gary's ear with a sword. Finally, Bobby Beausoleil stabbed Hinman to death. And just like they would later do at the Tate-LaBianca houses, the family smeared words in blood at the scene. Political piggy, with a paw print, as if the Black Panthers had done it. This was Manson's test run. his first murder by proxy. And it worked. His follower carried it out, just like he asked. But there was a problem. Gary Hinman didn't have money. The murder didn't fund the family. It didn't trigger the race war. It didn't do anything except leave another body behind. And that's when Manson's frustration boiled over. The prophecy he'd been preaching wasn't coming true fast enough. The world wasn't collapsing into chaos on its own. And so, he came to a terrifying conclusion. Maybe they had to help it along. If the family staged murders brutal enough, bizarre enough, and senseless enough, maybe they could spark the race war themselves. This was the turning point. The moment the family crossed the line from petty crime and isolated violence into full-scale mass murder. And once Manson gave himself permission to unleash that kind of chaos, there was no going back. Let's go back to when Charles Manson had been humiliated. Terry Melcher, the Hollywood producer he thought would make him a star, had turned him down. Worse, Melcher had moved out of the house at Cielo Drive, the very place Manson associated with betrayal and rejection. So, when Manson gave the order for a slaughter on the night of August 9th, 1969, his instructions were simple. Go to that house, kill everyone inside, and make it as gruesome as possible. To Manson, this was revenge. But here's the tragic twist. Terry Melcher wasn't there anymore. He hadn't lived there for months. The new tenants were people Manson barely knew, if at all. They were just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That night, Manson sent 4 of his most devoted followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. Kasabian would later be the lookout, too scared to join in the killings. The others? They went to work. The first victim was a complete stranger. Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old kid, had been visiting the caretaker in a guest house at the property. On his way out, his car was blocked at the gate by Tex Watson. Tex shot him point blank, checking him out instantly. Stephen Parent had nothing to do with Manson, nothing to do with Hollywood, just a teenager in the wrong driveway. Then came the house. Inside were 5 people. Sharon Tate, a rising actress, 8 months pregnant. Her husband, director Roman Polanski, was away in Europe. Staying with her were Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, and her boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer. Tex, Atkins, and Krenwinkel stormed the home. What happened next was sheer chaos. Frykowski was beaten with a gun, stabbed, and shot. Abigail Folger ran out onto the lawn in a desperate attempt to escape, but Patricia Krenwinkel chased her down, stabbing her again and again. Jay Sebring was shot and stabbed repeatedly while trying to protect Sharon Tate. And finally, Sharon herself, pleading for the life of her unborn baby, was tied with a rope around her neck. Her cries fell on deaf ears. She was stabbed 16 times. She and her child both checked out on the living room floor. Before leaving, the killers smeared one word across the front door in Sharon Tate's blood: pig. The next night, Manson wanted more. This time, he came along, but not to kill, only to direct. driving with Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, Kasabian, and now Leslie Van Houten. Manson picked a house at random in a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood. It belonged to Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Manson personally tied the couple up, then left the house, ordering his followers to finish the job. Tex, Patricia, and Leslie obeyed. Leno, a supermarket executive, was stabbed dozens of times. Rosemary was held down and stabbed as well. The brutality was ritualistic. When it was over, they left words scrawled on the walls and refrigerator in blood. Rise. Death to pigs. And again, Helter Skelter. 2 nights, 7 bodies. A pregnant woman, her unborn child, her friends, and 2 strangers who had never even heard of Charles Manson. The scenes were chaotic, frenzied, and horrifying, and the blood-written messages made it even worse. For police, those words would become the first puzzle pieces in understanding who could have possibly committed such madness. But in the moment, Los Angeles was in shock. A city that had been the backdrop for peace, love, and the counterculture revolution was now the stage for something else entirely. The birth of a nightmare. At first, the Los Angeles Police Department was lost. 2 separate crime scenes. 7 victims. No clear connection. The brutality was unlike anything they had ever seen. And the strange messages scrawled in blood, pig, helter skelter, rise, death to pigs, only deepened the confusion. Were the murders political, racial, random? For weeks, detectives chased false leads, blind to the fact that all the answers were sitting out in the desert at Spahn Ranch. The turning point came from an unexpected place. Susan Atkins, already in jail for her role in the killing of Gary Hinman, couldn't keep her mouth shut. Bragging to her cellmates, she laid out everything. The Tate murders, the LaBianca murders, the commands of Charles Manson. She spoke with pride, not shame, describing the violence in detail. Her boasts became the thread that finally tied the family to the crimes that had paralyzed Los Angeles. Here comes Vincent Bugliosi. The young deputy district attorney handed the unenviable task of prosecuting Manson and his followers. He faced a problem. Charles Manson had never plunged the knife himself, never pulled the trigger. Yet Bugliosi believed he could prove that Manson's words, his manipulation, his orders, carried the same weight as action. Bugliosi built his case, piece by piece. Susan Atkins's early confessions. Linda Kasabian, who agreed to testify in exchange for immunity, describing in vivid detail what she had seen during those nights of terror. The bloody words at the crime scenes, the rambling doctrine of Helter Skelter, which Bugliosi argued was not just madness, but motive. And then came the circus. In the courtroom, Manson turned the trial into a twisted stage play. He carved an X into his forehead, declaring he was outside of society. Soon, his followers did the same. They sang, they laughed, they glared at the jury, at the press, at the judge. It was chaos. A performance of loyalty meant to prove that even behind bars, Manson's control remained absolute. But control slipped away when the verdict was read. Guilty. Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were sentenced to death. Tex Watson would receive the same fate in a separate trial. For a moment, it looked as though justice had spoken clearly. And then, in 1972, the California Supreme Court struck down the death penalty. Overnight, the death sentences vanished. Manson and his followers, once condemned to die, now faced life in prison. The victims' families were forced to live with the knowledge that the killers would live too. Time has written the rest of the story. Charles Manson died in prison in 2017. Susan Atkins, stricken with cancer, died behind bars in 2009. Patricia Krenwinkel remains in prison, still the longest-serving female inmate in California. Tex Watson found religion in prison, but never freedom. Leslie Van Houten, after decades of appeals, was finally released in 2023. And Linda Kasabian, the lookout who turned witness, lived the rest of her life quietly, dying a free woman in 2023. The murders ended the dream of the 60s. They shattered the illusion of peace and love, exposing how easily words could be twisted into weapons. Charles Manson never needed an army, never needed a gun of his own. He only needed influence. And with it, he turned young lives into instruments of chaos, leaving a scar on American history that will never fade.